I'm Tim Allen. I'm at the London School of Economics and I direct the Firoz Lalji Institute, which has actually recently, not so recently, a year ago, absorbed the Centre for Women's Peace and Security. So, we have a real focus on the kind of issues that we've been talking about today. And I've been working in border spaces for a long time. Melissa and I have actually just come back from the Uganda side of the DRC border, looking at the Ugandan army going across the border where they're supporting M23. So we could perhaps talk about some of those things in the discussion. But we've got a very full panel, and we've got two speakers at the beginning who are presenting remotely. So maybe we should go to those straight away. So I think the first of those is Henri. Are you with us, Henri? Are you communicating? You're there. Yes. Great. So could we bring you on now, and could you speak for about 10 minutes? Is that okay? That would be great. Perfect. Thanks so much. Let me know if I go over time. Okay, I'll shout, yes. Okay, super.
Okay, I hope you can see that. Is the PowerPoint visible? Okay, great, thanks. So I'll be presenting on some research that we conducted over the past year on the borders of Myanmar and Thailand, and Myanmar and India, specifically Mizoram state. And this was research conducted by myself with Lalgren Sangi on Mizoram and Pionei Chi and Cholin, working with me on the Thai side. And I will take you very briefly through the methodology. It's generously funded by Accept, and it was conducted in the first half of 2024, 65 key informant interviews and 10 focus group discussions, both in person and online. And it was multi-sited, and I can talk more about that later if there's interest, in India and Mizoram state, but also in several urban centers in Thailand, Chiang Mai, Bangkok, and Mae Sot, and refugee camps in Mae Hong Son. And what we really want to do is look at diverse women's experiences of displacement and gender norm change in the post-coup period, referred to locally as the Spring Revolution. And we purposefully had a sample of women of different ages, of different waves, of different pathways of migration and displacement, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic backgrounds, sexual orientations and gender identities, as well as women with disabilities and chronic illnesses, or with care responsibilities for those who have disabilities and chronic illnesses. So some of the, and I'm happy to talk more about the detail later, but I'll just give you some of the top findings that we had. Some of the key concerns across the board that we saw were lack of legal support and documentation in both settings, and a fear of pushback to Myanmar, where there is a new conscription law that has been activated that also affects women. So there's a huge amount of insecurity there, fear that because they're undocumented migrants in India or in Thailand, that they will be pushed back, as has happened already, to Myanmar and immediately conscripted into the armed forces. Living expenses and livelihood challenges were the main concern, I would say, amongst all of the participants, except for a handful with financial capital and social capital that was enough for them to survive. And in addition to general livelihood challenges for all refugees, women especially faced labor exploitation challenges, disadvantages in the labor market, a double burdening with having to take care of care responsibilities, and all of this led to greater barriers to participation as they had much less time on their hands compared to men to participate in the political and social arenas that were available. There was also a lack of access to vocational education, especially for ones who had participated in strikes and the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar and now had to retrain, in a sense, to work in less skilled jobs. And there was younger education that has lost out on several years of education already prior to the coup due to COVID, and after the coup due to the protests and then displacement. Also, we saw a lot of isolation of the individual and refugee communities from the host communities due to language barriers and a lot of issues of loneliness, especially amongst elderly women respondents. Especially in Mizoram and Mae Hong Son, but also in other locations, there's a lack of access to services, especially for those with mobility constraints. And two key areas where there is definitely a lack of services is mental health and psychosocial support, but also programs and support services to prevent and respond to gender-based violence risks. And this also goes for the opposition governance structures that have emerged, which have been lackluster in that respect. As of beginning of this year, so this is outside of our research scope, but has impacted our the beneficiaries and partners we work with. There have been major cuts, as you know, to support programs, especially on the Thai-Myanmar border, following the freeze on USAID funding. And this is something that has been a huge impact, especially in Thailand. We also saw some resilience factors coming out, that there are services that are being provided formally and informally by diaspora NGOs and by ethnic minority organizations who are working across the border from Myanmar, especially in Mae Sot, Chiang Mai, and Mae Hong Son on the Thai border. There are also sort of ad hoc mutual support groups, and in Mizoram especially, where the Chin refugees are very much center their lives around Christianity. Faith-based spaces were really important for the women. They provide essential but often very limited support due to a lack of resources to the most needy. Alternate education systems have been set up to address this education gap that I mentioned, but there is an issue there with the lack of recognition of these degrees that the students get from these alternate education systems. There are also support systems amongst the Myanmar diaspora, especially in Thailand, where there is a long-standing history of migration across from Myanmar. But a lot of the job opportunities that the refugees get through these informal networks were quite exploitative in the labor market and rent market, especially of younger women. An interesting fact that we did also see was that while most of the refugees we spoke with, most of the refugee women tended to be quite isolated from the host community, there were a lot more connections between LGBTQI refugees and the Thai LGBTQI community, where the Myanmar refugees felt more accepted than amongst their fellow co-citizens. And there was a lot more cooperation between exile Myanmar and Thai LGBTQI activists organizing joint pride parades, for example. In terms of the question of whether or not the Spring Revolution has brought about gender norm change, we had sort of a mixed and somewhat paradoxical result. Across most of the interviewees that we spoke to, there was a palpable sense that there had been a sea change, that there had really been this increased awareness of women's rights and gender rights, increased women's participation, including in the political and military struggle against the military junta, that there was an increased acceptance of LGBTQI rights across Myanmar. But even though we saw these quite some positive developments in people's minds, in practice, in their everyday lives, decision-making at the family level, community level, in the opposition political movements remains heavily male-dominated and quite gerontocratic. Women really struggle to participate meaningfully due to double burdening and or because having internalized norms that they are not skilled enough to talk about political issues, that politics is a male space, or they're too young or too old to talk about politics. So we do have this dichotomy here where we have a rhetoric around gender norm change, but also continued patriarchal, gerontocratic, and heterosexist, heteronormative practices. And that also goes for the opposition groups, opposition movements who have made this part of their political agenda. Also, concerningly, there's a lack of serious responses to sexual harassment and gender-based violence cases amongst the refugee community, but also ones perpetrated by some of the leaders of the opposition movement. And this has led to a a backlash from women's rights organizations against some of the opposition groups as well. And happy to talk more about that later. So as mentioned, we really did want to take an intersectional lens to this issue of women's experiences of displacement. And we feel that this is something that is hugely important. And we saw that location, class, education, social capital, and networks that people can access really play a key role in reducing or increasing vulnerabilities. So the more of the social capital one has, the closer one is to service provision centers, the less the vulnerabilities. As mentioned, there are still age-based and gender-based barriers that women of different ages and ethnicities and education levels face in participating. Women of diverse SOGIESC also face barriers and discrimination, especially in the camps in Mahingson and Mizoram, and to a degree from the rest of the refugee community. We really did see this strain of the multiple burdening and depletion of women, especially for mothers and heads of female-headed households and widows, where they really struggle to make ends meet, make a living, but also care for their families. And especially Mizoram and Mahingson in the camps and outside the camps, very limited services and support for those with disabilities, chronic illnesses, and mobility issues. So conclusions, quite top-level ones: economic survival and double burdening leaves very little space and time for women to politically engage, even where they wanted to. Language barriers and isolation from host communities lead to this to a lack of access to services, but also a reliance on informal support networks, some of which are positive, but some of which are exploitative. There are definitely unmet needs across the service provision sector, but especially for sexual harassment and GBV prevention and response, for the addressing labor exploitation and trafficking risks. Disabilities and chronic illnesses are not really being addressed. Most of the medical services are quite limited and focused on more first aid kind of responses, and isolation and loneliness amongst especially some of the older populations, older women that we spoke to, is something that hasn't really been addressed at all. As mentioned, we see some gender norm changes, but persisting patriarchal, heteronormative, and age-based norms and dynamics. And as recommendations, there is a need for more targeted support.
Could you just, maybe people can see that on the screen. Is there anything in particular you wanted to highlight? But otherwise,
I will
yeah.
wrap it up there.
Yeah, so,
happy to.
But I'm just aware we've got limited time. But thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to the time. That was really helpful. Thanks so much. I think the next presentation actually picks up some of the same themes. Do we have the next speaker with us? That's Benjamin. Are you here?
Yeah.
You're there?
Yeah, I'm there.
You're there. Let me see you there. Okay. So can you... Yeah, brilliant. So can you now give us a talk for about 10 minutes? That would be super. You're on a you're in a different border. You're on a different border. Yes.
Exactly. Sort of we're around the same country, but towards the border, in the border space, towards Bangladesh now. So this is some brief insights of our joint research, together with also AnnaSophia, who's also here participating virtually from Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies in the Arnold Bergstrasse Institute, and my colleague Ziada Rosanna Rashid from Dhaka University, funded here in this program. What I want to raise attention to first is sort of that we're trying to look at this border space as such, and that we, of course, have been seeing how violent conflict has evolved in this border space, and how the evolution of violence in Myanmar, and particularly in last year, in 2024, fighting in Rakhine was at the highest levels of the past years. So, you might know that in 2017, you had this mass displacement of the Rohingya, more than 700,000 Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh. But actually, in this last year, so you even had more conflict events and also more fatalities than in 2017. One key aspect sort of that we want to argue is sort of that we really have to understand also the situation of the forcibly displaced Rohingya in Bangladesh through the lens of transnationalism or translocality. So you cannot detach the situation of the Rohingya in the camps from the developments in Rakhine State in particular. Moreover, it's important to note that even though there's more than 1 million Rohingya living in this Cox's Bazar district, in these different refugee camps in the region, most of them are really right at the border to Myanmar. But it's always, we have to bear in mind, it's a regional displacement constellation where sort of onward movements towards Indonesia and Malaysia, but also to India, but now also to Sri Lanka, for instance, play a very significant role. I come back to that a bit later. So in our research, we focused on different facets of gendered violence. I will speak first now about violence against Rohingya women and girls. Most of you, I think, are aware that also in this context, we have this continuum of violence from the war in Myanmar, where rape was used as a weapon of war against the Rohingya throughout the displacement journey to the refugee camps now. So you have different forms of violence now that also intersect with one another and that are really also directly related to one another, whether this is physical assault, sexual assault and rape, or the denial of resources. So it's clear sort of that in this sort of there are a lot of organizations working in the Rohingya camps with survivors and trying to support the women. And it's clear you have an increasing prevalence of sexualized violence since particularly since 2018-19 over the past years. We try to understand the situation of gendered violence through what we call a nested approach. So coming back to old school thinking from with Johan Galtung, trying to understand the acts of direct violence, how they are embedded in structural violence, but also how there's cultural violence implicit in it. I won't go to it in detail. We've just submitted a journal article where we elaborate that a bit more. What I want to point to here again is sort of that often, when we talk about violence, I think the notion of spatiality is disregarded, and I really appreciate and applaud also the EXCEPT research program for bringing more attention to the different facets of spatiality in this research strand. What we did, our colleagues, led by my colleague Annas and colleague from Dhaka University, we conducted empirical field research, mainly in the Rohingya camps and with displaced Rohingya, conducted around focus group discussions and personal interviews with a total of more than 180 people, and mainly between April and May last year. So some of our key findings. So in the debate in the region, sort of you see that the NGOs and also all the organizations working in the sector, they mainly focus on intimate partner violence. So where sort of the partners, the spouses also are seen as the main perpetrators. But there's a quite recent trend that has emerged, particularly last year, sort of that sexual violence and other forms of gendered violence committed by members of armed groups are increasingly recognized and are also starting to be recorded by the authorities and the people working in the GBV sector. So one key informant, for instance, told us that we've seen a lot of rape incidents by armed groups, and no one can say anything against them. The victims do not report it out of fear, thinking that if it is disclosed, it might threaten their family. These groups are much more powerful than before. So you have new forms of gendered violence there, sort of armed group members, sort of they use their power and force younger women into marriages. There's abduction and rape of women, and part of it is also that this violence is used as a weapon in the internal power struggles between different armed groups who were ruling these camps informally. There's a lack of trust in the authorities, so therefore most cases actually also go not reported. There's no rigid prosecution of the perpetrators, so which leads really to a large widespread fear of the people from armed groups, but also a sense of powerlessness among the people. There is decisive support for the survivors through many NGOs working in the GBV sector, what it's called there. But of course, people there, the women are trying to adapt themselves, they're evading risks, they're trying to reduce mobility in order to reduce their own susceptibility to gendered violence. Also, early marriage must be seen as an important adaptation strategy to this pervasive risks. There's a lot of campaigns in terms of awareness raising, where, let's say, the gendered norms are trying to be changed within the community. But we also noted that a lot of these trainings also that they're important, but they are insufficient if they're not sort of owned in terms of what is communicated and how gender roles are perceived, if that's not owned by the community itself. We want to highlight that gendered violence is more than violence against women. In particular, sort of during the time of our research, we noted there was a lot of violence against young Rohingya men, particularly like forced conscriptions that happening. So in a focus group discussion, it was, for instance, mentioned that we experienced violence from the military and Buddhist community in Myanmar, but here we are frightened by our own people. They force Rohingya women to marry them, abduct young men, to fight in Myanmar, and threaten all innocent people who oppose their actions. So in total, it's estimated that 3,000 to 5,000 Rohingya men were threatened, were abducted and forcibly recruited to join one of these armed groups that are operating in the camps. The men were then trafficked across the border to Myanmar, trained in hideouts, sort of in the jungle, so to speak, to prepare for fighting, and then forced to fight for the Myanmar military or the Arakan army, or also within fractions of the Rohingya armed groups who are fighting directly in Rakhine themselves. Also, the men, of course, they're also not helpless in a sense. The young men, they're trying to hide as well and leave. Many have left the camp at night. And also you see that many actually now have been fleeing to other places in Bangladesh, to India, Indonesia, and Malaysia, precisely because of the rising insecurity in the camps and because of the risk that is linked to that of being forcibly recruited to join one of these armed groups. When men leave, this in turn also often means that some women are somewhat left behind without their male guardians, which in turn again might enhance their risk of gendered violence. And as I mentioned before, sort of threats and sexual violence against women is also used as a leverage, as a mechanism against the male relatives. Importantly, here in this regard is also the notion of masculinity. So there's a large moral pressure that is there within the community towards young men in particular to fight and to join fighting for the cause of the Rohingya. So joining the armed groups is a matter of being man, a transition to manhood as well, and a question of like defending and preserving of Rohingya-ness, so to speak. Coming quickly to the questions that were posed to us for this round in terms of immobility. First, I mean, of course, there's an immobilization that we are seeing here. So there, I will wrap up. So the Rohingya are immobilized in the camps, and this immobilization is actually a root cause of dependency on humanitarian aid, on their own precarity and gendered violence. But we have to know the micro-mobilities and translocal networks that are there. So people are moving in and out of the camps, going to markets, to cities, to working in agriculture, salt mining and other aspects within the region. But this mobility is curtailed through official policies. Mobility is an important aspect in the gendered responses to the risk of violence, as I have mentioned. And you see that cross-border mobility within the region is an essential element of the political economy in that region. So the circulation of licit and illicit goods, for instance, trafficking of drugs also is a very crucial aspect. And then last aspect here, sort of that you need to take note of the transnational networks and onward migration and how they're also shaping patterns of violence. So for instance, if you look at cases of kidnapping and trafficking and marriage markets, so you see it's really linked to the transnational networks in which the Rohingya themselves are embedded. So key message then from us is that when you try to understand how gendered violence unfolds in the camp, you cannot only look at the camp, but you need to really embrace a translocal and transnational perspective to better understand it. That's all. Thank you.
And that's just been released. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for keeping to time. Great. And it worked very well with the first presentation. Now, I think now we have a special subversion of the proceedings, and Philip is coming to the front to tell us what happens next. He's going to perform magic tricks or something, is it? No.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, all right. And then we'll continue with the order we have here after that. Is that right?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chloe and Grace, for organizing that, for sort of squeezing me in here at the last minute as well. Yeah, we've been sort of changing the program just a little bit, and you'll probably be able to see why as I sort of go along. But what I want to do in 10 minutes, hopefully less, is to share some reflections from some ongoing research that we're doing, which focuses on the experiences of agency exercised by forced migrants with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions in Uganda, in Turkey, and in Lebanon. And this is collaborative work with my wonderful colleagues Onen David Ongwech, who unfortunately isn't able to join us today, and Pinar Erdem, and you'll have the pleasure to learn from Pinar after this in just a little bit. So I think it's kind of like a tandem presentation where I will bore you with some of the premises, and then when you're almost asleep, Pinar will sort of sweep in and get you, going with all her fascinating insights. So bear with me for a little bit until you can hear the insightful aspects. For this work that we're doing, we're collaborating with trusted interlocutors in these three countries with whom all three of us have worked with for decades. We're collaborating with different civil society organizations, and in Uganda specifically with the queer refugee-led organization. And in doing this work, we're building, of course, on a growing body of scholarship, but also policy making and reporting sort of on this issue. And there's sort of course, several interlocking premises of this work, of which I want to highlight and identify two as particularly relevant for this here. First of all, I think there is an urgent need for us to disentangle and nuance this growing engagement with queer or LGBTQI issues in context of conflict and displacement, whereby I think there often is a tendency to sort of, put together a whole catalog of different, very diverse and very nuanced experiences in this alphabet soup of LGBTQI and sort of mash them all together and thereby gloss over a whole variety of very different, very intersectional differences. And, Pinar will sort of tell us a little bit more about what that sort of looks like in practice. But I think, it's sort of needless to say that the experience of, the gay middle-class lawyer who finds himself in Beirut is vastly different from the black, poor, trans woman living in a refugee camp, yet we sort of put them into one category and explain that as the queer experience, as if there would be one such thing, universalizing over all these different, parts of the alphabet soup there. Then there's also, a tendency to sort of often place that sort of as a third category, in addition to there's women and girls, there's men and boys, and there's LGBTQI. But where does the lesbian woman fall? Where does the gay man fall? Are they not, in the man and in the LGBTQI category? And so I think there's need for us to, as I said, disentangle and nuance some of these analytical frames that we're working with, and to pay attention to these intersectional nuances. The second overarching premise that we identify in this emerging engagement is that we find that there's what we would refer to as a violation-centric view, which I think is particularly pronounced in some of the sort of advocacy, activism, and NGO reporting on this issue, whereby there is an overwhelming, if not even sometimes exclusive, focus on queer forced migrants' experiences of violence and vulnerabilities and violations. And often that even boils down further to a focus on conflict-related sexual violence in a very narrow sense. Again, glossing over a whole catalog of different gendered experiences, but also glossing over of forms of violence, but also glossing over a whole variety of experiences that make up their human lives and complex life more broadly, right? Without a doubt, it is incredibly important to highlight these forms of discrimination and violence and abuse, and it's a very important step forward from not attending to this issue at all to sort of bring these experiences into the spotlight. But I think the danger of any violation-centric view, no matter what group of people we speak about, I think is that there's an inherent risk that it reduces people to these experiences of violence only, and as I said, thereby ignores the complexities of humans' experiences and human lives, right? And I think when we look at, the reporting and the scholarship that's out there on queer refugees in particular, we see the emergence of what Fadi Saleh has termed the figure of the suffering Syrian gay refugee as sort of the prototypical, image of whom we sort of speak of and in what terms when our attention is directed there. And I think it's sort of encapsulated both of these dimensions, right? Sort of it's the gay refugee, as sort of the symbolism for LGBTQI and all the diversity that comes with it, and the suffering subject of that. And I think such an exclusive focus on violence and suffering amounts to what Eve Tuck, an indigenous scholar, refers to as damage-centered research, which is research that invites people to only speak from that space in the margin, and that is a sign of deprivation or a wound or an unfulfilled longing, well, again, overshadowing all of these other aspects of their experiences. And so with our project, we want to join an overarching process of trying to counter some of these tendencies and sort of to write against them, and to make us aware of these complexities, to also acknowledge the ways in which queer forced migrants are not just passively subjected to violence, but also how they actively engage with their experiences, how they come together and support one another, how they derive meaning from these forms of engagement and support, and also how they sometimes derive joy or pleasure or love or care from these encounters and these engagements. Of course, all of these speaks to, trends and aspects that previous speakers have highlighted of sort of putting agency more to the center of our discussions, which I think is something that hasn't been looked at when it comes to queer refugees. But it also sort of tries to make us aware of, there's... Sorry about that. That's confused me a little bit. What was I saying? Right. Okay. So there's these tendencies of sort of highlighting agency. I think what we need to be aware of is sort of not falling into this trap of sort of, turning towards agency, which often I think there's a tendency, and thereby sort of leave all of the violence and the violations behind, especially again in scholarship, in activism and NGO reports, you would find these depictions of the activist who has sort of turned to agency and sort of left everything else behind, which again reduces complexities, and invite us to acknowledge, the fact that exercising agency does not negate vulnerabilities. Being vulnerable does not negate agency, but, we hold these multiple complex truths sort of in one embrace. And I think that's sort of one of the key takeaways that I think we want to sort of put forward there. What do we mean by agency? I'm not entirely sure, so I'll maybe skip that part. I know what we don't mean by that. I think essentially we refer to people's capacities to act. It's something that I think is inherent to each and every one of our human conditions, just like vulnerabilities too. But it's also obviously structured, inherently by sort of gendered norms, by, class, by race. by a whole set of intersecting factors, whereby, of course, aspects of heteronormativity, of queerphobia, of homophobia in contexts like Uganda, Lebanon, or Turkey are inherently structuring the possibilities to which people can exercise agency or cannot. But they do carve out those moments to do that. So all of this has been very conceptual. I don't know how much time I've got left, Tim, but I'll try to. I've got no time at all. Okay. So that's brilliant. I'll sort of leave it at that then, and then sort of let Pinar sort of take that and maybe fill some of that with examples. And if you have desire for more examples of what this agency can look like, then we'll return to that in the Q&A. But yeah, thank you for bearing with me so far. And Pinar.
Just bear with me. Long password. Okay. So, yep. So, hi, everyone. My name is Pinar. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bremen, Institute for Intercultural International Studies, under the supervision of dear Philip. And as you can see, it's amazing. And no pressure about that, intro. So I'm currently focusing on the experiences of invisibility of LGBTQ forced migrant women in Turkey in relation to both their vulnerabilities and agency. I'm interested in exploring how LGBTQ women who are forcibly displaced in Turkey experience not only different layers of gendered vulnerabilities, but also how they navigate these vulnerabilities and exercise different forms of agency in an environment where anti-LGBT and anti-refugee rhetoric is on the rise. I decided to focus on this topic as a result of a recent research I have conducted for Mosaic MENA, which is an NGO based in Beirut. We worked on that project together with dear Henri. So yes, this panel is basically full of dear mentors of mine. And we recently published our report on violence against refugee women of diverse OGS in Lebanon and Turkey. So you can find it online in the Mosaic website. And I'm using parts of that data for my PhD as well. So that will be, I will be talking about that, and base what I say on that empirical data, basically, which has very similar parts with what Henri and Benjamin said at the beginning. So to give you a bit of context on Turkey and Lebanon, especially for those who may not have an idea about these two countries. So Turkey hosts the highest number of refugees globally, and Lebanon hosts the higher number of refugees in the MENA region. And in both countries, LGBTIQ+ people are subjected to violence, abuse, and discrimination on a daily basis. So neither of these countries are safe havens, so to say, for LGBTIQ refugees. And especially during the presidential and parliamentary elections in Turkey in 2023, the political discourse was full of anti-refugee and anti-LGBTI sentiments, which led to a rising xenophobia and homophobia and transphobia in the country, while in 2024, the heteronormative political backlash in Lebanon was escalating. And these are heightened by religious intolerance against persons of diverse OGS in both countries, and increased political mobilization around the protection of sacred family values. For example, in Turkey, 2025 is declared as the Year of Family. Let's see how that goes. And there's a whole anti-gender movement going on in both countries and around the world, as we all have been witnessing. Why LGBTQ women? So in recent years, there has been an increasing attention in research policy, humanitarian protection towards diverse OGS vulnerabilities in the MENA region, especially after the Syrian civil war. However, the focus has mostly been on gay men and to the extent on trans women. And as Philip mentioned, there is this tendency to approach LGBTIQ refugees as a homogeneous group. And as a lawyer, I'm well aware that the usage of this acronym is essential for visibility and the rights advocacy. However, gender and sexuality intersect with other factors which produce different degrees of risk of exposure to violence, such as age, location, social class, ethno-religious background, migration status, the degree of visible nonconformity with gender norms, which I'm mostly interested in. And therefore, if research policy and service providers, humanitarian actors fail to take into account queer experiences and needs separately, many letters of the acronym may and do fall into the cracks unintentionally. On the other hand, it seems like there's a little understanding of the intersections of the categories of women and persons of diverse GESI. So research, policy, and also protection mechanisms targeting the needs of refugee women focus only on the experiences of cis-hetero refugee women, as if queer women are a different species, as Philip also mentioned. So they do not take into account how not conforming to dominant heterosexist and or cisgender norms and expectations greatly increases diverse GESI women's risks of encountering violence, on top of the broader discrimination and violence women face in patriarchal societies. And to give you an example, humanitarian organizations and service providers who provide services to LGBTIQ refugees in Turkey and Lebanon face challenges accessing specifically to Syrian lesbian women, for example. And the reason is most Syrian women come to Turkey with their families, unlike, for example, Iranian women or Iranian lesbian or bisexual women. So most of them are in forced marriages or they are closeted to their families, and therefore they're unable to escape the grip of their families, fearing of violence, obviously, if their GESI is revealed to them. And compared to trans Syrian women, Syrian lesbian women mostly do not have ties with the queer community, so they do not have access to information of existing services. So if mainstream service providers take into account and identify the experiences and vulnerabilities and needs of women with diverse sexual orientations, this might be a way to enable Syrian lesbians to access their needs with proper referral mechanisms, for example, so like mainstreaming, which we keep saying. I will mention a few points on service provision later, but now I would like to talk about their experiences of violence and vulnerabilities to better illustrate the role of sexual orientation and gender identity and other intersecting identities in creating these gendered vulnerabilities. So LGBTQ refugee women are subjected to a continuum of violence based on different intersecting factors, as I said, such as time, so in Turkey or Lebanon or in their home countries, space, be it public or private, so such as their homes, workplaces, cafes, restaurants, streets, markets, public transportation, and by different actors, be it state or non-state. And incidents show intersecting drivers of violence and discrimination such as misogyny, lesbophobia, biphobia, and transphobia and xenophobia. And as I just mentioned, the degree of which they are visibly non-conforming with gender norms plays a huge role in the experiences of violence. Especially in the case of Syrian women, they are subjected to physical and sexual violence, verbal harassment for their non-conforming appearances, and death threats by their family members once their identity is exposed. As I said, most of them live with their families in these countries still. Trans refugee women are most likely to be subjected to sexual violence and assault by members of the public, including rape, due to them being visibly non-conforming. Lesbian and bisexual refugee women are also subjected to sexual harassment by their employers and other employees based on their sexual orientation. Lesbian women are subjected to discrimination and harassment in the streets for having a more masculine look, which include acts such as swearing, spitting in front of them, and constant staring. In both countries, they are poorly treated by the police and immigration officers. Therefore, there's a lack of trust towards them, which leads to the lack of reporting and seeking services. And in numerous cases, the Turkish police has refused to receive complaints from LGBTQ refugee women if they were alone and not accompanied by service providers such as legal counsels or translators, for example. So having mentioned this, I want to also talk a bit about the access to needs and services in Turkey and Lebanon, how these systems designed and programmed to provide protection actually fail to do so and actually contribute to the gendered vulnerabilities they face in both countries. Sure. Specialized services tailored for the needs of women of diverse GESI are basically very limited in these both countries. Safe spaces are mostly non-existent. Therefore, these service units and service provision is really important for them to be able to visibly themselves. They face challenges in accessing health services for various reasons, such as poverty, refugee status, There are no designated shelters for LGBTQ women in both countries, and they face challenges in accessing women's shelters designated for cis hetero women. So there's also, very shortly, the resettlement process I would like to touch upon. It's very slow, so it's very time consuming, and LGBTIQ refugees are basically left in a limbo for years. And for most of them, resettling to a third country is their only hope to live a better life, find a job, go through gender reassignment surgery, continue their studies, have a partner and children maybe. And right now, in the case of Syrian women, with the fall of the Assad regime, the US and EU are canceling flights and not accepting resettlement at the moment. That's what I'm told by my colleagues on the field. So the idea is there's no war, so you can go back home. But going back is not a choice for LGBTQ women. So we need to continue advocating on this issue specifically. So that was a lot. But basically, as you can see, like visibility and invisibility, it plays an important role in the lives of LGBTQ refugee women on a daily basis, both as a risk factor when they are read as deviating from rigid gender norms, or when they fall between the cracks in service provision, or when they are hyper-visibilized by the government or during asylum processes, as Philip mentioned. But also, it's a means of agency. So as Olusegun Tabunga also call it, I love this sentence basically, it's a double-edged sword. I think it portrays it very well. So to mitigate the risks of physical violence in public spaces, in their homes, by their families, the women of diverse OGS hide their gender identity, and they use this as a way to protect themselves from violence and discrimination in order to pass as gender conforming. And to me, this is very powerful. Yes, it's a daily struggle to constantly be in and out of the closet, obviously, and living with masks is not ideal. However, being able to navigate their vulnerabilities, to me, is the light, as Chloe said in the morning in this story. So I will keep working on it, and let's see what I end up with the end of the PhD journey. So thanks for listening to me. I hope that was not quick, but thank you.
No, perfect. You're on time. And we have Marie now. Yes. Where's Marie? You're there. Yes, from SIPRI. Yes. You're going to talk about examining the impacts of humanitarian and development interventions in cross-border settings on women and girls, case studies from Eastern Chad and Darfur region.
Yes. So hi everyone. So I will now present research conducted by SIPRI and BICC with the generous funding of ICSAPT in Eastern Chad. So I will start with a quick picture of the context because I'm cautious of the time. So since April 2023, the conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces has triggered the world's largest and fastest growing displacement crisis. Over 12.9 million people are displaced, including 3 million who fled to neighboring countries, namely Egypt, South Sudan, and Chad. So the humanitarian crisis is devastating. There are a lot of statistics that I will not share, but the needs are staggering, and there's no end in sight to the conflict that's actually escalating in the latest weeks with latest offensives. Although this conflict reflects historical patterns of violence that have repeatedly displaced populations in the region, the scale is now immense and rather unprecedented. So why are we looking specifically at Eastern Chad, and why are we looking at women and girls only? So SIPRI carried out research on humanitarian protection already in the Liptako-Gourma region. So it's Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And the results there showed differences between different categories of the population. And as in other contexts in the Sahel, the Sudan-Chad borderlands is a space of cross-border mobility. Most Chadian and Sudanese people do not perceive it as a barrier, but rather as a bridge due to ethnic ties, family ties, and business as well ties. However, this border is also synonymous of political instability, and the spillovers effect that were mentioned in other contexts this morning. At the moment, Eastern Chad it's estimated that Eastern Chad hosts over 730,000 Sudanese refugees and Chadian returnees. That's on top of 400,000 Sudanese refugees who fled the Darfur armed conflict in 2003 and 2004. So these are in a protected displacement situation. But most importantly, women and girls make up around 89% of new arrivals based on the time of writing. And we know that based on research, they face specific threats and that their activities that they are traditionally tasked with expose them to certain risks that I will discuss. We also know that women face gender barriers to humanitarian assistance in some contexts, that is before, during, and after the provision of aid. So to better understand these dynamics and the impact of conflict and displacement on women and girls, the research employed a mixed methods approach to center women experiences. We started with a quantitative survey, which is a perception survey conducted with 264 displaced women who are Sudanese refugees, Chadian returnees, but also Chadian host communities. And we also conducted 41 interviews with female refugees, host community, humanitarian workers, and local authorities, which include men because they were usually more involved in those roles. And we also had 4 focus group discussions. So the field work was carried out by our partner, BICC, the Chadian research organization, with a team of 4 female research assistants in April and May 2024 in 4 different refugee camps across 3 different provinces in eastern Chad. So one of the most prominent findings is actually the multi-layered and the continuum of violence that displaced women experience before, during, and after displacement. Before fleeing Sudan, the majority of surveyed women had actually already endured violence that forced them to leave, such as psychological violence, the looting and burning of their homes, illegal searches as well, physical violence, more precisely ethnic discrimination as well, and sexual violence. And the testimonies that we collected also highlight the dangers of forced displacement, with women describing robbery, assault, ethnic discrimination as well, and separation from their families, their husbands, and sometimes their children as well, on their way to Chad. And in the camps, although the majority of women do report feeling safer, this is only relative safety, because our findings show that resource scarcity is another form of insecurity for these displaced women. They indeed reported psychological and physical violence, cases of harassment and sexual exploitation. They also expressed fear for their safety, but not only, also for their children's, and more specifically for their daughters, who face a greater risk of sexual gender-based violence. So these patterns reflect the gender nature of the conflict, where women's body have become an extension of the battleground, and that this, to some extent, persists in refugee camps. When it comes to life-saving assistance, despite the mobilization of humanitarian organizations and local authorities on arrival, the majority of surveyed women stressed critical gaps in protection, in aid provision, and gender-sensitive programming. The prevalence of food shortage is a top priority, along with the lack of clean water and basic hygiene products, including also menstrual hygiene products, which affect their capacities to take care of themselves, but also of their children. But perhaps more interestingly here as well, the research clearly shows that women and girls are also preoccupied by the limited access to education for themselves. Some would like to continue their studies as they were studying in Sudan, and their children as well as the lack of economic opportunities. 65% of women reported also that assistance does not meet their needs as women, which they themselves explain by the lack of understanding of women's needs by humanitarian organizations, a lot of assumptions there, and the lack of consultation. And I would like to stress that latest point because it's really critical. If women cannot communicate their needs, then how can aid be effective and answer their needs? So these gaps in assistance can be explained by multiple factors, but I will go only over 3 main ones. So, well, perhaps the most obvious one, the response is largely underfunded. In 2023, only 45% of the requirements were covered, and the humanitarian response in Chad remains to this day largely underfunded. Last year, the refugee response plan, more specifically, was only funded to 30% in Chad. So this has direct consequences on assistance, with some assistance stopping months ago, sometimes years ago, in an organization like the World Food Programme, having to revise their targets for 2024 and this year. And the scale of the crisis, as I said earlier, is unprecedented, which also means that the camps are overcrowded and overwhelmed. These 4 camps was actually established in 2004, and you have now extensions of the camps. But the infrastructure, such as schools, etc., is more located in the former camps. So it exposes refugees to actually further safety risks when they have to go get assistance. And the situation in Chad as well has changed. It's a challenge. Multidimensional poverty is high. The land availability and productivity are rather low, which means that there are less resources for both host communities and then to an extension also to refugees. So beyond these humanitarian challenges, we also found that displacement is also transforming gender roles and community dynamics. In many cases, women have become the head of households, as men are either absent, seeking work elsewhere in Chad or neighboring countries, or have remained in Sudan. So these women who came lost everything. That's what they were sharing with us. Even if they fled with some of their belongings, they were actually roped on their way to Chad. And they have to carry out activities that they're not used to, such as fetching water. And that is quite important to stress here because around 65% of the women who were surveyed actually came from urban areas where they had access to infrastructure in their homes. So these tasks are rather new to them as well. So they take on additional responsibilities, and without sustainable income sources, many remain trapped in cycles of economic dependency and precarious survival strategies, which expose them further to exploitation. Despite no major concern related to aid equity, there are still risks, of course, for tensions between various groups. This goes between newly arrived refugees, long-term displaced refugees as well. There are perceptions there that long-term refugees are better off than newly arrived refugees, which can be explained by different factors, including that long-term refugees also had opportunities to build networks of solidarity and get economic opportunities in the meantime. And returnees also, for example, tend to feel left off in comparison to refugees. Some of them are located more in the villages and not in the camps, so they are further away from infrastructure and services, for example. So what do we do with this information? What can be done to address these interconnected challenges? Well, the research tells us a part of the story, but that part is very clear. Displaced Sudanese women and girls face serious risks and deep uncertainty about their futures, notably the risk of having no income-generating activity, no access to education, or very limited access to education. And when they have access to education for their children, some of their children, for example, when they have to travel to the former camps to attend school, they are not fed when they go there. You have this kind of school feeding programs, but these usually apply to long-term refugees households. So yet they're not passive victims, and we raised that in previous presentations as well, but that's really important here to mention. Many have taken on new roles as heads of households, caregivers, community leaders as well in some examples. Some women as well who traveled and that were surveyed for this study were also activists in Sudan. I don't have time to go over this, but in the report we also highlight their roles in 2019 and the revolution in Sudan. So, and ensuring their protection is not only a humanitarian imperative, although I centered here my presentation on humanitarian assistance, but it's also essential for building long-term stability and resilience in the Chad-Sudan borderlands. So pointing in that direction, we provided a set of targeted recommendations that I will not all list here. But the most critical, of course, will be to stop the conflict, but that's out of the scope for these actors, humanitarian actors. So the most obvious for them, and yet challenging in terms of competing priorities and perspectives as well these days, is to increase funding, of course, and to pay more attention as well to Sudan and neighboring countries who are suffering from the spillovers of the conflict. Also make humanitarian aid more gender responsive. Women's experiences in displacement are also shaped by their intersecting identities, including gender, age, socioeconomic background, ethno-religious background. And humanitarian programs must actually reflect this complexity and ensure that aid is tailored to their needs. Otherwise, they risk actually reinforcing some of the inequalities that these women are exposed to. Of course, improve protection against gender-based violence and provide also psychosocial support for survivors. That was something that was raised as well by our research assistants who were there, who filled this field work journals for us. That was really useful to understand better the conflict and also the context, and also to better interpret. We were talking about interpretation this morning, but these findings are also really key for us to understand the environment in which the interviews were also conducted. And there was this mention as well of the lack of trauma response for Sudanese women refugees. And we often mention as well to amplify voices, give voices to women, but women are not voiceless. The issue is that we are not listening to them. So it's also key for humanitarian actors to provide more spaces for that to happen. They exist. For example, WFP is having these project management committees, but in a situation of emergency, such as the situation in Eastern Chad, it's also challenging to implement, also because there is not enough funding for the staff as well, and not enough time and capacity. And of course, support host communities to prevent tension. That is already done by some projects, namely the World Bank has a project there as well that support host communities, but this needs to be done more systematically. I will stop here, or yes? Yeah.
Thank you. And last but not least, where's AnnaSophia?
There's two.
There's two of you?
Yeah.
But you've got 5 minutes. Not too bad for time. People have been quite disciplined, or maybe I've been ferocious enough. So, are you going to be 10 minutes between the two of you?
Yeah, we're going to, yeah, we're sure.
12.
Yeah, 12.
Hold you to it.
We see you 10 and we raise you 12. We do have slides, though, somewhere, please. I emailed them.
Maybe you should just tell us a story while we're waiting.
Once upon a time. It's AnnaSophia Gallagher. I don't know where. I can't see.
Which email? Do you remember?
Chloe and the global security. I don't know. Okay. But we can start in the interest of time as well, and then hopefully the slides will follow. If I can remember them. So anyway, thanks Chloe and Grace for organizing. I'm AnnaSophia, this is my colleague Gaëlle. We're both primarily based in Beirut, and we're going to talk about boat migration from Lebanon, which is an emerging phenomenon in the last couple of years, and it's really intensified in the last 2 years, actually. So, next slide, please. Oh, okay. So that's what we're going to talk about. We did some research in the first half of 2024. And at the time, there wasn't, I can see here, at the time, there was there was no academic work done on the matter, nor any policy literature. So it was really a very sort of unknown phenomenon. But anyway, long story short, we did 24 key informant interviews with 2 different cohorts, so international stakeholders with an interest in the matter, as well as local stakeholders, so some community gatekeepers. Our overarching interest was what are the safety and security outcomes for men and women, girls and boys who attempt to leave. It's worth noting that we received quite a lot of rejections, including from people that we had professional relationships with. But I think that speaks to the domestic and actually European sensitivity of the subject at the time. So the EU elections were ongoing, but also domestically in Lebanon, the sort of Syrian refugee question has been very sensitive, and at the time was particularly polarized. I won't give you a vast overview of Lebanon's very dynamic context, but just to situate it slightly, obviously there was an economic collapse in Lebanon in 2019. During our research period, there was fighting between Hezbollah and Israel in South Lebanon, which over the research period escalated to nationwide. And also there was this question amongst European stakeholders of, is Syria safe? So should the refugees be returning? What does it mean to be safe, etc.? So it was a very dynamic, very sensitive period to do this research. And to give you a bit of an idea of the numbers, in 2019, people thought there were about 200 people a year were leaving on boats to Cyprus, a bit to Italy, but mostly to Cyprus. By 2023, that was 5,000 people a year who were recorded. And the same numbers were being recorded in 2024 until the conflict seriously escalated. Next slide, or can I move it? You can move it. Okay, just to give you sort of a brief overview of the intersectional patterns of mobility, I'm going to start with nationality. So it was primarily, or is primarily Syrians who attempt to leave Lebanon on boats, but the figures of Lebanese people trying to leave were vastly increasing. There were also Palestinians leaving. Interestingly, there were some migrant workers who were also leaving. For those who don't know, there are about 250,000 migrant workers in Lebanon, the vast majority of whom are from sub-Saharan African countries and are women. So some of them, in terms of gendered mobility patterns, some of them we understood were pressured to leave by male partners, but largely, actually, they weren't leaving, even though they themselves found themselves in desperate conditions. So I should note that the boat migration was really driven by desperation. So all of the people who were leaving were living in truly horrific circumstances, and they didn't, socioeconomic circumstances, and they didn't see any futures for themselves. So interestingly, some of the migrant workers, the women's groups, said that they didn't leave because their community trust was very strong and their communication between the groups was very strong. So they communicated risks of sexual violence or risks of other types of violence on specific routes. So they would then trust their stories of what could happen, and that actually prevented them from leaving, even though they would like to leave Lebanon, but this prevented them from taking irregular routes. Another thing that's interesting is that for nationalities, for domestic migrant workers whose embassies were actually effective, so I think pretty much the only one is the Filipino embassy, they did not feel like the boats were a reasonable route to take. But for other nationalities who felt that their embassy didn't support them, they recognized that boats were an option, but that was also counterbalanced by the sort of stories of danger that their countrywomen or countrymen told them. In terms of gender, obviously, as we see with other mobility research, from people who, in terms of people who leave, men are obviously overrepresented. There were some instances we saw of men pressuring their female partners to go with them. We also saw some indications that women were reporting that they would leave based on emotional desperation. They felt compelled to leave the country, where men reported more that they wanted to leave because of pull factors. They were interested in economic opportunity elsewhere. There was also interesting sort of age differentials as well. So again, younger men seem to be more pushed to leave by desperation and a really pervasive sense of hopelessness in Lebanon. And this is across nationalities. Whereas older men were also motivated by the pull factor of improved economic circumstances elsewhere. And in cases where people reported to us, in cases where children were sent alone, predominantly it was male children. Next slide, please. So very briefly, given that our research was also exploratory, we saw some indications of gendered risks at sea, and Gaëlle will talk later about in interactions with security agencies. But because men were overrepresented in the travel, we see that, again, more men were perhaps facing scenarios of kidnapping and ransom related to sort of being scammed for their travel. Women indicated a very keen awareness of the risks of SGBV in this journey, unless accompanied by a male family member, although this didn't seem to stop them from taking the journey, but they noted they were aware of these risks. And interestingly, and also tragically, we noted some instances as well of where the boat sinks, women and children drown first, because unfortunately they tend to not be able to swim, and or for safety reasons they are put in a cabin that's locked sometimes to also keep them safe. So where the boat has capsized or met poor weather, the women and children drown first, even though that action was taken to ostensibly protect them. Next slide, please. Gaëlle, we'll talk about the legal framework.
So first, in terms of the legal framework, Lebanon is officially part of the Palermo Agreement, which regulates the question of migrants and human trafficking. However, the national laws are not compatible with Lebanon's international commitments. For example, there is no clear definition. The law does not define what is human smuggling or human trafficking. And there are some discrepancies in terms of the judiciary decisions that are usually taken. So some judges would consider that these crimes are a felony, others would consider that this is a misdemeanor. And there is no clear separation by law between the smuggler and the migrant or the person who's being trafficked. And it is also important to note that there is no clear state policy around the question of migration, and more specifically, migration by the sea. Next, please. This means that with this policy vacuum, the only actors who are taking any decision or making the policy are the security agencies and law enforcement agencies. And even here, the picture is a bit complex because we have the army involved, the general security, which is the intelligence agency in Lebanon, and the ISF, who are the police, also involved in this question of migration by the sea. So prior to departure, usually migrants are arrested by the army if they're arrested, or by the police. Once at sea, they're usually intercepted by the army, the navy, and sometimes by the UN, by the UNIFIL, if they're departing from South Lebanon, because this is where the UNIFIL's mandate is. But after interception, Lebanese nationals are usually handed to the police and their cases are processed by the police. However, it's a bit more complex for Syrian refugees who are handed to the general security and where they face delayed processes and where we also received some reports of mistreatment or delays on purpose. Usually, women and children are released faster than men in these cases, but this is the picture of the provisions taken by Lebanese agencies.
Yeah, and one small point on women and children being released more quickly. So in our other work that we've done together in Lebanon, because we work with security agencies, we've seen that quite a lot, actually, because typically, especially now post-crisis, operationally, the security agencies actually don't have female staff, or the female staff are oftentimes not available, so there might be no one to search the women, there might be no one to guard women's cells, etc., and or quite simply, they don't know what to do with them. And there might be this sort of perception that women are not criminal and or problems. I'm not suggesting that migration is criminal, by the way, but generally speaking, in interacting with the security services, there's just this big question mark over women. So actually, what that means is, in many scenarios, not just when they're stopped trying to leave by the sea, they're just released very quickly, unless there's some really outstanding reason why they wouldn't be. Next slide, please. So just to speak briefly about this, and our paper looks at this in a lot more detail and evidences this a lot more. So we were looking at, our research question was on the safety and security outcomes for people trying to leave by the sea. And during the research, we also took a step back and we kind of looked at what are the security practices and governance mechanisms of mobility that interact with these insecurities or sort of exacerbate these insecurities, or in some cases create these insecurities. So we looked at, as we were conducting our research, we were looking at foreign-funded border control programs specifically, and how that interacts. And we found a number of sort of central pillars of challenges or areas of interest that relate to maritime migration. So we found that a lot of these programs were state-centric, but they weren't even state-centric in that they benefited the interests of the Lebanese state. They were primarily state-centric in that they upheld the primacy of the European state that was funding the security intervention. I should note that some of these interventions are reform-oriented in different ways. Some of them attempt to be more reform-focused, but don't necessarily succeed. Some of them are only nominally reform-focused. A lot of them are just pure assistance programs, so they're very sort of delineated, very transactional. So yeah, there really was this primacy of European state security. So migration by the sea was very much couched in language about hybrid threats, transnational threats. So you would see that in a sentence with, smuggling, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, terrorism, which is actually quite interesting because I won't go into it much here, but we in terms of human smuggling, we understood from our research that the smuggling networks were not necessarily human trafficking. It was individual communities, community members who wanted to leave, who had a boat, who could drive the boat. So they would kind of join together as a small community and then leave together. So it wasn't really it wasn't a human trafficking dynamic, but certainly the language around this was very much, this is a threat to European security. Yeah, thank you. So when there's a threat to state security, naturally the army is the logical defense partner, which resulted in an over-militarization of border control management. And I think if we jump down to here, what was quite interesting about that and problematic for the Lebanese state and also problematic for the sort of knock-on insecurity that it engendered is that it overwhelmingly overburdened the army. So the army was really the primary partner at the expense of the police, the intelligence agency, and the other security agency, and or sort of civilian government. So the army was kind of de facto forced into this position where it is the migration partner. It's supposed to almost make policy decisions as well as be an operational and implementing partner. So the army really has had to take on this role at the expense of the sustainability of the rest of the sector and at the expense really of sort of a human security focus, because that is also by nature not necessarily the army's job. The army has a defense mandate. Yeah. And can we just go back briefly? In terms of technocratic bias as well, there's something interesting. I mean, there's a lot to be said there, but in terms of gender and gender mainstreaming, again, these programs would really only tick boxes of saying, well, we should hire more female soldiers, for example, or give some soldiers training on some nebulous concept on gender, which the research also showed wasn't necessarily particularly not even badly received, it just wasn't understood in the context of the sort of broader challenges. So the final slide, please. I mean, there are many recommendations, but to come out of this, but if we were looking at improving the human security outcomes for the people who are trying to migrate, whether they get stopped in the sea or on the land, there's a question of collaboration amongst other government agencies, so not just from defense and security partners. So there's a question about collaboration with civil society. There's a kind of very much a siloing of data. So humanitarian actors would have some data, but the security agencies wouldn't really. So there's really a strong recommendation there to coordinate, collaborate, and share data, share the little amount of data that exists, as well as gender disaggregate the data, because there was very much a political question of, as well, it's just Syrians who are traveling, so it's just nationality focused. They're kind of rendered into this political body of people who are traveling, and there's no nuance about age, other demographic markers. It's just Syrians are leaving, which isn't really necessarily the case, or only the case. And then obviously there are recommendations for the Lebanese, the domestic government taking true ownership over the question, as opposed to sort of driven by various foreign actors. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe everybody should come up. We've got a few minutes before lunch. Managed to about 10 minutes for anybody got any questions or we want to discuss any of the issues. They're quite diverse presentations, but there are obviously overlaps between them. Is there enough room for everybody? You should come up as well. You shouldn't feel abandoned at the back. All right. Come on, stand. Yes. Should be there at the front.
Maybe you can lie down like this.
Lie down.
It's fine now.
Move a chair.
Oh, it's broken.
So we don't want to run over because I know everybody's really eager for some lunch. Has anybody got a question? Anybody want to start the questions? Can anybody think of a question that links all the talks together? Chloe should do that because she put them all on the same panel. So I think an overall. Oh, yeah, I saw a tentative that was like that. Yeah, go on. Yeah, go on. Go for it. Go for it.
No, it was something that Philip said, and I think you started with mentioning class as a sort of element that influences experiences. And I thought that that's not really something that... Oh, there's an echo.
Just shout.
Yeah, I'll hold it like this. Yeah, I wondered, because in your subsequent discussion that didn't really come up, but I was wondering whether, if you're high class, middle class, whether that sort of buys you out or makes it possible for you to buy yourself out from being in, or having these vulnerabilities. So I wonder what your perspective is of that and how it intersects with other categories that you're studying.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. And I mean, I was rambling on and then I didn't get to speak of any examples, so it was all a bit abstract. I mean, it's definitely a factor amongst many which sort of shapes people's experiences, right? Like class is a factor that sort of is, you know, an enhancing risk factor for vulnerabilities and forms of violence, but it also allows people to move in different spheres, in different contexts, to maybe have access to, you know, education or other resources, which I think then dictate the ways in which and the moments in time at which people can be agentive or exercise agency. But it wouldn't be something that buys you out of that, right? I mean, it's not possible to buy you out of that at all. But
something positive that sort of makes it a little bit easier. How does it intersect?
I mean, I don't know if it's inherently positive. I mean, you know, like I could think of an example of like, I don't know, you know, in the Ugandan context where we work with these queer migrants who are part of this queer refugee-led organization, right? Like the people who are sort of the face of that organization, who sort of, you know, are joined in meetings like this, perhaps in Kampala, you know, would be people who have a university degree amongst sort of this group. And they were able to do that because of the certain sort of, you know, class status or socioeconomic status that they had before and that they continue to have. So I think it's a factor that, you know, gets them into spaces where they can do that, which maybe other people within that group could not, because they maybe wouldn't speak the language, they wouldn't maybe sort of be part of that vocabulary. So it definitely mitigates. But I mean, I don't know if that's inherently positive then, because I think the flip side of that, you know, this co-construction is also that, you know, heightened agency and activism and visibility, you know, can be viewed as a good thing, but it also exposes people to much more risks and violence and abuse in that space. So there's, you know, that sort of, I mean, that's sort of what I was trying to get at with this, holding all of these truths in one embrace and not viewing that as either positive or negative, but just a co-construction of realities. Yeah. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I had a general question, which is like maybe something we won't have a chance to talk about now, but just occurs to me listening to you all and something that we all need to think about, is that all this research that we've been hearing about is dealing with categories that are being cancelled at the moment, you know, gender's being cancelled. Also, we have a drift towards the right in Europe, and that's partly to do with not taking any migrants. Yeah? And this research, my research too, many years now, has been funded from engagement from international aid, a kind of a willingness to engage with these things. And that's been pulled away. It's much more difficult to get grants, even small grants, to fund the sort of research you're doing. So we're sort of moving into a space in which the aspirations that you've all made for improvements are aspirations in a space where there's no interest on the other side at all. And even the space in which you've been able to do your research, you in a sense bear witness, is being closed off. So what happens in these circumstances? Chloe, you have an answer.
No. Should maybe your suggestion at the ending, thank you, yeah, an extraordinary panel. And I actually found kind of bringing into the insecurity sector being quite a big piece. And I wonder if something we might see, and Siren, I'm glad we have you speaking in the final panel too. You know, as aid in the UK, for example, is being cut, that is to increase defence. Defence is opening up, you know, to just in small ways, this idea of human security. And I know we have some folks online who also do this human security work within UK defence. I don't know what this is going to look like, in this new context and setting. And I know that David in the closing panel will also kind of raise some really big cautions around this kind of militarization of this space. There's a question for me kind of around, is this something that is going to, are military security sector actors going to be playing more of a role in the space? And what do we do about that, given that there's understandably discomfort among many of us? I do bits of defense engagement. People who know me know that. And it's a tension I hold, but I, continue to have intention. What will this look like if this is the direction that things are going? And so maybe that's a question I'd have too. What does this mean for engaging with a wider range of actors? Is this something we'll see kind of more globally? How do we feel about it? Yeah.
I think it's a really important point, this kind of issue of the military, isn't it? Because, we're coming out of epidemics where the military have become very seriously involved. We had a Security Council resolution on West Africa, under Chapter 7 to allow enforcement for an epidemic. And we've had militarized deployment to force people to be vaccinated in several African countries. So we're moving into a realm in which securitization is becoming militarization, and that's acceptable, even amongst actors that have previously resisted it. Was there a question online that I'm missing?
Bench.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. First also for all the very, very enlightening talks. Just a quick comment on your question. I think we're always doing research, let's say, on moving sand, right? On shifting sands, and this is always what we have to contextualize and what we have to grasp through our research as well. So, for instance, when we did our research in Bangladesh, it was like there was so much turmoil going on in Myanmar, and with the escalation of the conflict, and now Rakhine State is ruled by a different party than when we started our research. And sort of this whole huge transformations, and then just after we had closed our research, there was a revolution taking place in Bangladesh, right? So with a student uprising also now leading to a new interim government. And now when I was there just at the end of January or so, then we had the decision with US aid drawing out and removing from funding. And all of these transformations, they will change the actor constellations of the people who are active in this. And in terms of, and this can always be seen negatively, but it might also open up opportunities for unlocking situations. So, for instance, this protracted displacement situations have been emerging there and who have been predominantly viewed through a security lens. In the case of Bangladesh, for instance, just the withdrawing of funding might lead to an opening up of the refugee camps because just simply there's not enough resources available to maintain this humanitarian encampment approach, which in the end might actually have positive benefits. It's not sure yet, but I think it's really difficult to grasp all these transformations always taking place, but it's important to incorporate them.
Yes, it kind of highlights that we're in a state of crisis, and a state of crisis is a time of opportunity, isn't it? So maybe that's something we should go forward into the afternoon with, a kind of a sense of optimism. Thank you very much for everybody who spoke on the panel.